Today I'm gonna test and review the new Vallejo XPRESS colors and tell you why these are beating the shit out of the Citadel contrast range. First off, I want to see how they feel under the brush. And in order to do that, I'm gonna put all the colors on this piece of cardboard, which it wasn't very absorbent and it was white, so it was convenient. This is just to get a general idea of the property of these colors. So how saturated they are, how much thinning do they need, and yada 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 yada. Since I ain't no big famous YouTuber, Vallejo didn't offer to send me some samples. I managed to convince the amazing Juan Hidalgo to send me some paints. That's all I can do. Deal with it. At my disposal I have 3 different browns: yellow, red, violet, purple, blue, grayish blue, and green. Putting them on this palette, they do feel really consistent for both the dilution required and the saturation and the amount of pigment. Another plus that I immediately notice about these paints is that they don't tend to become that goopy, that weird substance when they dry on a palette, and they stay wet for a semi-long period of time. I'm guessing their dry time is quite different from contrast paint, which it can be a plus, but also maybe not. Now that I have a general idea on how they work, I want to test them on an actual miniature, a whole miniature, not just parts of it or just bits of it. I really want to test all their properties, where they shine and where they struggle. And this is why in this phase I will test the following things: how they behave on non-organic surfaces, then I will test how they behave on organic surfaces, how they behave through the airbrush, and finally I'm gonna test how these paints handle glazing. I think it has a pivotal importance to differentiate between organic surfaces and artificial surfaces, because at this point it's pretty much well known that these kind of paints struggle with artificial surfaces, flat surfaces in general, because they risk ending up a little bit spotty and not good. And since these paints are targeted for beginners, I will not try to be as careful and self-conscious about how I apply the paint, because that would be cheating. But let's just start, shall we? Starting off with the first towel, I will start applying this grayish blue and the red in some smaller parts of the armor to function as accents. All the models that I'm gonna test these paints on have been sprayed with the airbrush to create a sort of underpainting, but probably the best way and easiest way to use this type of paint is to just prime them in a lighter primer. This was my first try and my first application, and in retrospect I think I thinned out more than what it needed, and this is reflected on this spottiness of the upper parts of the armor. Even thinned down a little bit too much, I was actually happy with the results, so I moved on to the red accents. The overall experience was good. It was really quick to do, and even though the red accent required a bit more attention and care, because it would have been hard to correct mistakes if I would have, painted over the bluish armor. And this is maybe a big con about this kind of paint. I mean, all these kind of paints, speed paints, army paint or contrast, whatever, is that if you make a mistake, it's very hard to fix it with like regular colors, because you're gonna have to, identify the right color, blah 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 blah. That's so annoying. Do you really want to do that? No, you don't. On the second model, I will apply yellow on the armor, and I will use some violet to give a little accent here and there. This time I found the right dilution after getting my hand warmed up on the other miniature, and boy, let me tell ya, this yellow is great. This was so satisfying to apply, very covering, very powerful, very non-frustrating. And with the violet accent, it reached a point that I really love it. I really loved it, because the color harmony was really nice and the violet itself was really nice and beautiful as well. Saturated, very, zen to apply. Probably one of my favorite paints overall. So generally, a very good experience with this one. On this last model, I'm applying red on the armor and I'm using blue for the color accent. I probably committed the same mistakes I did in the first one, that is applying too thin down color on the highlights. I'm always a little bit scared of applying this kind of paint without any dilution, but I guess these are kind of made for that. But I'm scared, okay? Don't judge me. The yellow, with its infamous reputation, allowed me to be more heavy-handed and less scared about applying paint basically without thinning it down. And then I got back to my fear with the red, and I kind of applied it in a very thinned out way. But, you know, my conclusion is that you can easily apply these pretty much undiluted. So what are my conclusions regarding the application on inorganic surfaces? Well, to me, they look pretty good and spot on. There is a slight amount of staining on some surfaces, but you won't be able to see it from tabletop, so I think they look pretty. And also the yellow is amazing, like I said. But now let's move on to organic surfaces where they should shine more. I will use this Warcrime model to test the property of these colors and how they behave on a more organic surface, starting off with the skin. Here I go very light because I wanted the skin to be a little bit more pale. Still, it tinted the surface the way I expected, so I was really happy with it. Moving on to the cape, I really wanted to be faithful to the box art because I like it very much, so I had to mix yellow and red to create an orange. And wow, this orange is so vibrant, amazing, really. This also tells me that these paints can handle mixing as well, which is very good. The elephant in the room here is the fact that with these methods, the fabrics aren't really represented in a very realistic manner because the paint tends to pull in the recesses. And for clothes, most of the times, I mean, pretty much always, it's not like that in real life. But this has nothing to do with the express paints themselves, but more on the method that you are picking. So far so good, let's test with the airbrush. I'm gonna test the covering power and the smoothness of the spray with this application. I barely have to dilute the paint, they already work as they are, which is good, especially if you struggle with the airbrush. I spray the red first and then I add a little yellow in there so I can create an orange, and then I spray pure yellow. The yellow in the dark areas had a bit of a hard time to cover the black parts, but I guess it's pretty much understandable. I still insist on the fact that you should be using these paints on a lighter primed figure, not on the zenithal primed figure or an underpainting like I did in this video. I then spray some magenta and the shadows to, you know, complete the look a little bit, make it a little bit more nice, because, yeah, I can use the airbrush like a pro. And I gotta say, I'm pretty satisfied with the experience, and I think these paints are gonna be able to do amazing glazes with the airbrush as well. Now I'm gonna test glazing. At this point, I don't think it's gonna be necessary to test more than one color, because in the previous test, we asserted with a good amount of certainty that this color range is pretty consistent throughout. And also, I didn't feel like glazing 3 or 4 Space Marines. So you just get one. Okay? I started with a base coat of lighter yellowish green, and then I started glazing with very thin down paint. I chose green, of course, in this case. This will also test the reactivation issues, because this way of painting requires to go over the same area over and 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 over. For me, this is a big no. The first application was a nightmare. The paint didn't flow well from the brush to the surface, it left streaks and nasty marks. But since I wasn't sure that it wasn't my fault if the paint behaved like this, I decided to reapply it. The second experience was a little bit better, but still I think it's pretty inconvenient to use this method with these paints, for the simple fact as well that they take way too long to dry, and if you want to glaze, you kind of need a paint that dries out fast, because otherwise it's gonna take you eons to paint a single figure. Glazing is a already pretty slow method, so I'm guessing through the airbrush though you shouldn't have the same issue. So why do I think these paints are beating the shit out of the contrast range? Well, because they are. Actually, they have pros and cons, but I think in this case, pros outweigh the cons. First off, what amazed me the most is that they are pretty consistent throughout the range. In the Games Workshop contrast range, some paints are thinner, some paints are thicker, some are more saturated, some are meh. The Express colors also dry a little bit slower, which allows you to, wet blend. And differently from the contrast paints, they don't create that goopy substance when they're starting to dry on the wet palette. They come in dropper bottles, which in this case, just in this case, it's a good thing. Because these paints in general, they're pretty thin and it's hard to just pick them up with the back of the brush. So in this case, pots are actually pretty inconvenient. And I have to stick my brush in and it goes near the ferrule and it hurts my brain. Ugh. The pigments are so vibrant, especially the yellow and the violet, which were the paints I like the most. Still, I wish they listed the pigments on the bottle. Just checking if I was bullshitting you. And also, the price point, I can tell you, is gonna be very, very, very competitive. On the other hand, the first con that I have is that it's a pretty small range, 23 colors, I think, which I think it might also be good sometimes because you are kind of cohorted into mixing your own shades or whatever. But also you have less paints to display, of course. And we love paints, right? The consistency might frighten a little bit at the beginning because they're quite thick. So that might make some people thinning the paint more than what they need, like it actually happened to me. Oopsie. And the other critique that I have for this paint is for glazing. Like I said, I don't think they perform well in this task, and I was kind of disappointed with this because I think glazing with this kind of paint makes it a little bit more easy for beginners to understand consistency. It is true then that in the second try, I managed to get the paint pretty much where I wanted, and it was a less frustrating experience, but still, it wasn't good enough. It's definitely good to have a paint that performs more than one task, but realistically speaking, there is not gonna be a perfect paint that can perform any action that you want. And in conclusion, I would say yes to Express paints. That's it for now. If you want to see more products that are killing Games Workshop, click here and see you back there. Yeah, the new bottles suck.